Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are strapping in for something intense. It's like a historical thriller, really, but it's all true. And it centers on one man whose, well, personal issues became the engine for a global catastrophe.
We're talking about Wilhelm II, yeah.
Yeah.
The last German emperor.
Exactly. Wilhelm II.
And this isn't just, looking at a monarch. It's a real character study, isn't it? Mm-hmm. A deep dive into someone deeply flawed. You've got this immense ambition on one hand, but then this crippling insecurity on the other.
Right. And he inherits this absolute powerhouse Germany at the time, industrially, militarily. It's primed.
Totally primed. And somehow he manages to steer it straight into the biggest war the world had ever seen. It's quite a story.
So our mission today, we're trying to approach this almost cinematically. We want to unpack that dramatic, kind of erratic personality of Wilhelm II and trace how his obsession really with personal rule, how that led to his empire collapsing and Europe just plunging into the Great War.
And we've got some great material to work with. Details from his birth, which was traumatic in itself, right through to his very strange, almost defiant life in exile. We're looking for those moments where the personal stuff, it just becomes fatally political.
Yeah.
Yeah,
where the private flaw becomes public policy with disastrous results.
Okay, so when you start digging into Wilhelm II, the first thing that hits you is this massive paradox. He's Queen Victoria's eldest grandchild, blood ties to Britain, to Russia.
Right, deeply connected to the European royal network.
But then he has this incredibly intense, almost love-hate relationship with Britain, his mother's country. It's bizarre.
And he's ruling arguably the most modern nation in the world at that point. Technologically advanced, military might, industrial power.
Exactly. But the way he governs, it's all impulse. It's driven by the insecurities of, a deeply wounded individual. It's not rational statecraft a lot of the time.
Attention, that's key, isn't it? The gap between the power he actually held and the sort of constant validation he seemed to need.
It defines his reign, absolutely. And it sets the stage for what we see later policies swinging wildly, not because of strategy, but because he felt slighted or because he wanted, a round of applause on the world stage. ###B, a traumatic beginning.
Yeah.
Childhood and disability.
And those insecurities, the sources are really clear on this. They go right back to the beginning. Literally his birth in 1859.
Yeah, let's paint that picture. It's the Crown Prince's palace in Berlin. His mother, Vicky, Queen Victoria's daughter, the Princess Royal, she's going through this absolutely horrific, long labor.
It was a breech birth, which was incredibly dangerous then.
Extremely dangerous. And the doctors were, frankly, panicking. The sources mentioned Vicky was given just heavy, constant doses of chloroform to cope with the pain.
Which might have had other consequences, too.
Well, some modern medical thinking suggests it could have led to oxygen deprivation for the baby prince, hypoxia. And that might explain some of the traits people saw later, the hyperactivity, the erratic behavior, maybe even impaired social judgment, things that, really echo throughout his public life.
But the immediate damage, the physical damage, that was undeniable.
Well, completely. During the delivery, trying to manage the breech, a physician forcibly pulled the infant's left arm downwards. In doing so, he tore the brachial plexus nerves,
resulting in Erb's palsy.
Exactly. It left Wilhelm with a withered, paralyzed left arm, significantly shorter than his right, maybe 6 inches, about 15 centimeters shorter. It was useless, really.
And think about that. The future emperor, the supreme warlord of Prussia, of Germany, visibly, physically impaired in a culture that idolized military perfection.
The psychological impact must have been immense. Just imagine. He couldn't do a proper military salute. He struggled to cut his food at the table. Riding a horse initially was a nightmare.
So he had to constantly perform competence, didn't he, to hide it?
Absolutely. A lifelong performance. You see it in photos all the time. He'd cleverly hold a pair of white gloves in his left hand to make it look longer, or he'd rest the arm stiffly on his sword hilt, or just lean on a cane. Anything to project strength and, normalcy.
And his mother, Vicky, her attempts to fix him, they didn't exactly help, did they?
No, they seem to have made things worse, psychologically at least. She was obsessed with making him a competent heir, especially a competent rider.
Those riding lessons.
Brutal, by his own account. He described being forced onto the horse, weeping, aged 8, constantly falling off, only to be put straight back on.
Yeah.
Over and over until he finally learned to balance, sometimes with the bad arm literally tied to his body.
God, that's awful.
He later said those torments, as he called them, inflicted on him in childhood by his mother, were the root of the deep mental conflicts that plagued him his whole life. #C family conflicts and Prussian identity.
So those experiences, they really drove a wedge between him and his parents, didn't they? Vicky and his father, Frederick III, they represented something he came to reject.
Completely. His parents were liberals, really. They admired the British model, wanted Wilhelm to grow up understanding constitutional monarchy, British liberalism.
But he went the other way. Hard.
Violently resisted it. He got Prussianized, as people said. His tutors were much more conservative, pushing autocratic ideas, and this just widened the gap with his parents. He saw them as too English, too weak, frankly. He despised the idea of Germany following Britain's parliamentary path.
And the relationship with Vicky, his mother, it just became toxic.
It really did. He seemed to associate her directly with his disability, with his feelings of weakness. There's this chilling outburst recorded in 1889.
What did he say?
He basically raged that an English doctor killed my father and an English doctor crippled my arm, which is the fault of my mother, because she supposedly preferred English doctors.
Wow. That says everything, doesn't it? The personal resentment, the rejection of the British connection, all tangled up.
It absolutely encapsulates it. He's rejecting that side of himself, embracing this hyper-masculine, autocratic Prussian military identity instead.
Which leads us straight to 1888, the pivotal year.
Right. The year of the three emperors, an incredible sequence of events. First, his grandfather, Wilhelm I, dies. He was 90. Then his father, Frederick III, finally becomes emperor. But he's already dying of throat cancer. He lasts just 99 days.
99 days.
And suddenly, Wilhelm II is emperor at just 29 years old. And he's not just inheriting the title. He is determined to rule, personally. Personal rule.
Which was a massive break from his grandfather, right?
Wilhelm I had deferred hugely to Bismarck.
Hugely. Wilhelm I understood the balance. Wilhelm II saw Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, as an obstacle to his own power, his own glory. He wanted to be the one making the decisions, not just signing off on them. #D, the insecure character.
It seems the very structure of the German Empire allowed for this, didn't it? The Constitution gave the emperor significant power, but Wilhelm I had used it differently. Exactly. The Constitution was, you could argue, deliberately designed to give the emperor considerable leeway. Wilhelm used that power with deference to his experienced chancellor. Wilhelm II, driven by that deep insecurity, that need to prove himself because of the arm. He saw any constitutional limits, any reliance on ministers, as getting in the way of his personal destiny.
So, ambition fueled by insecurity, that really sums up his character.
I think so. The historian Thomas Nippert put it really well. He described Wilhelm as gifted, quick mind, sometimes brilliant, definitely interested in modern things, industry, technology, big ships.
Yeah.
But also superficial, hasty, restless, without any deeper level of seriousness. He lacked gravitas, maybe.
And needed constant affirmation.
Desperately. Bismarck's famous quip was that Wilhelm wanted every day to be his birthday. He needed applause, validation. And this wasn't just a domestic thing. It completely poisoned his foreign policy, too.
Especially with Britain. Let's talk about that relationship, particularly with his uncle, King Edward VII.
Oh, it was toxic. Absolutely toxic. Wilhelm despised Edward, called him the old peacock.
Why such animosity?
Because Edward, who was much older and smoother, treated Wilhelm like a slightly annoying nephew, not like an equal sovereign. And Wilhelm couldn't stand it. He saw British naval power, British prestige, Edward's easy diplomatic influence. It was all a constant grating reminder of his own perceived shortcomings, his own country's maybe newness on the world stage compared to the established British Empire.
So that love-hate dynamic again.
Exactly. Intense. He craved Britain's acceptance, maybe even its admiration, but he also deeply resented its superiority. It guaranteed that when he finally got his hands on the levers of power, his policies would be laser-focused on challenging Britain, on aggressively asserting Germany's status, often in the most clumsy ways possible.
Okay, so Wilhelm's on the throne, young, ambitious, insecure. And looming over everything is Otto von Bismarck, the man who basically built the German Empire. The clash seems inevitable.
Oh, it was absolutely inevitable from day one, really.
Yeah.
It wasn't just politics. It was a fundamental battle over who actually ran the country.
Bismarck represented the old way.
Yes. The system where the experienced chancellor, the statesman, held the real power, and the emperor, well, reigned, but didn't necessarily rule in detail. Wilhelm saw Bismarck as this overbearing, boorish, old killjoy, as he apparently called him. Someone standing in the way of his personal rule.
So it was a constitutional fight, deep down. Who's really in charge?
Precisely. And the trigger, interestingly, was domestic policy, the anti-socialist laws. Bismarck wanted to crack down hard on the growing Social Democratic Party with really repressive measures.
But Wilhelm initially took a different line.
Surprisingly, yes. He kind of positioned himself early on as concerned with social issues, maybe even pro-worker, especially after a big miners' strike in 1889. He saw an opportunity, perhaps, to win popular support away from the socialists.
How did Bismarck react to that?
Badly. He fundamentally distrusted any kind of social reform. He actually refused to co-sign a proclamation Wilhelm wanted about protecting industrial workers. That was a direct challenge, violating the need for the Chancellor's countersignature.
But that wasn't the final straw, was it?
No, the final straw was about pure power. And, from Wilhelm's perspective, disrespect. Bismarck's coalition in the Reichstag had collapsed. So Bismarck started trying to build a new one, reaching out to the opposition Catholic Center Party.
Without telling the Kaiser first.
Exactly, without consulting Wilhelm. For the Kaiser, this was unthinkable. It was Bismarck acting like he was the government, treating Wilhelm like a non-entity.
So Wilhelm confronted him.
Oh, yeah. Apparently, burst into Bismarck's office, demanded he sign some order about ministerial access. It got very heated. Bismarck, furious at being treated this way after decades of service, basically threw his resignation at Wilhelm in a blistering letter.
And Wilhelm accepted it, just like that, dropping the pilot, as the famous cartoon showed it.
He did. And this immediately raises a huge point, the whole Bismarck myth. The story that immediately grew up was that Wilhelm, the impulsive young Kaiser, had recklessly destroyed Germany's stable government.
But there's another side to that.
There is. People like Wilhelm's own grandson, Prince Louis Ferdinand, argued later that Bismarck's time was up, that he'd become too powerful, trying to create a sort of shogunate where he ruled and kept the emperor sidelined.
And that Bismarck himself had left Germany quite divided. The anti-Catholic Kulturkampf, the anti-socialist laws.
Absolutely. Bismarck's legacy wasn't all stability. He'd alienated huge chunks of the population. But, and this is the crucial but, firing him created an immediate, massive power vacuum.
Yeah.
And a policy vacuum.
Because Bismarck wasn't just running domestic policy, was he? He had this incredibly complex web of foreign alliances.
Exactly. Things like the reinsurance treaty with Russia, designed to keep Russia and France apart. When Bismarck went, that complex system just crumbled. Partly because Wilhelm didn't understand it or didn't value it, and partly because the men he appointed to replace Bismarck, people like Caprivi, Hohenlohe, Bülow, they were competent administrators maybe, but they weren't seasoned statesmen of Bismarck's caliber.
So the new course, as Wilhelm called it, meant the Kaiser was now firmly in charge of direction.
Yes, decisively influencing government. But it also meant replacing experienced, independent-minded figures with loyal civil servants who wouldn't challenge the Kaiser's personal rule. And that had huge consequences, especially in foreign policy. #B, the drive for Weltpolitik.
Right, so Bismarck's cautious continental focus is out. What comes in?
Aggression. Global ambition. Wilhelm called it Weltpolitik, world policy. He was absolutely obsessed with showing the world that Germany wasn't just a European land power anymore. It was a global player.
Because Germany was changing rapidly, wasn't it? Industrially, economically.
Hugely. It was Europe's biggest manufacturer by then. Wilhelm felt Germany deserved its place in the sun, as he put it. This meant grabbing colonies wherever they could in China, the Pacific Islands.
But the real engine of this Weltpolitik, the bit that really set alarm bells ringing elsewhere, was the Navy, right?
The Navy.
Yeah.
That was Wilhelm's personal obsession, tied directly back to his insecurity complex, his rivalry with Britain, his resentment of the Royal Navy. He wanted a German fleet that could challenge Britain's dominance.
And he found the man to build it in Admiral Tirpitz.
Alfred von Tirpitz, appointed in 1897. He wasn't just building ships. He had a specific provocative strategy. The risk theory.
The risk theory. What was that?
The idea wasn't necessarily to outbuild the Royal Navy. Germany probably couldn't afford that anyway. The goal was to build a German high seas fleet powerful enough, concentrated in the North Sea, that if Britain did try to blockade or attack it, the British Navy would suffer such heavy losses, even in victory, that it would be too weak to defend its global empire against other rivals like France or the U.S.
So it's not about winning a sea battle. It's about making the risk of a battle too high for Britain. Diplomatic leverage through naval threat.
Exactly. It's naval blackmail, essentially. Force Britain to make concessions, treat Germany as an equal, because the cost of confrontation would be suicidal for the British Empire.
And how did London react to this risk theory?
With absolute alarm. Unquestioned naval supremacy wasn't just about prestige for Britain, it was existential. They needed the Navy to protect trade routes, import food, defend the empire. This German challenge was seen as a direct threat.
Leading to the naval arms race.
A massive, incredibly expensive naval arms race. especially after Britain launched HMS Dreadnought in 1906, revolutionizing battleship design. Both countries started pouring vast sums into building bigger, better battleships. And it fundamentally changed geopolitics. It cemented Germany as Britain's primary potential enemy and pushed Britain into alliances it might not otherwise have made, like the Entente Cordiale with France, its traditional rival.
And Wilhelm wasn't just focusing on the North Sea, was he? He was also looking towards the Ottoman Empire.
Yes, very actively. Those state visits he made 1889, 1898, later in 1917, they were highly political. Part trade mission, part assertion of German influence.
Securing arms deals.
Big ones. German rifles for the Ottoman army. But the really big prize was the concession to build the Berlin-Baghdad Railway.
Which sounds commercially sensible, but politically.
Politically, it was dynamite. It cut right across spheres of influence that Britain considered its own, particularly threatening British control in the Persian Gulf and potentially offering a route to challenge British India. It was a huge strategic move.
And then there was that speech in Damascus.
Ah, yes, 1898, at Saladin's tomb. Wilhelm dramatically declares himself the friend and protector of the world's 300 million Mohammedans.
Which must have gone down interestingly in London and Paris, with their vast Muslim colonial populations.
You can imagine. It was pure political theater designed to annoy the other imperial powers and position Germany as this new force in global affairs. It was classic Wilhelm grand gesture, potentially inflammatory, directly challenging the established order. It was Weltpolitik in action, but driven by his personality. Hashtag see diplomatic blunders and public scandals.
The trouble was, wasn't it, that this grand strategy of Weltpolitik kept getting derailed by Wilhelm himself, his lack of tact, his impulsiveness.
Utterly. The gap between the supposed grand strategy and the Kaiser's actual pronouncements, often off the cuff, became Germany's biggest diplomatic weakness. He just couldn't seem to help himself.
It's almost like a comedy of errors, but with potentially tragic consequences, like the Kruger telegram in 1896.
A perfect example. He sends this congratulatory telegram to Paul Kruger, the president of the Transvaal Republic in South Africa, after they'd captured the leaders of the Jameson raid, this unauthorized raid by British colonists.
How was that received in Britain?
Terribly. It was seen as direct German interference in British imperial affairs, siding with the Boers against Britain. Huge public outcry. Completely unnecessary own goal.
And then the Hun speech in 1900.
Oh, the Hun speech. This was his farewell address to German troops heading off to China as part of the international force to suppress the Boxer Rebellion.
And he told them.
He told them to be utterly ruthless. No quarter will be given. Prisoners will not be taken. And then the killer line. Just as the Huns, under their King Attila, made a name for themselves, may the name German be affirmed by you in such a way in China that no Chinese will ever again dare to look cross-eyed at a German.
He actually invoked Attila the Hun.
He did. It was shocking and incredibly damaging long-term. It handed Allied propagandists the perfect epithet, the Huns, to use against German soldiers in World War I. The German Foreign Office apparently went into meltdown trying to get the Hun reference edited out before the speech was widely published, but it was too late.
It just shows that disconnect, doesn't it, between the Kaiser's dramatic impulses and what's needed for actual diplomacy.
Completely. Which leads us to maybe the most famous blunder, the Daily Telegraph affair in 1908. This one actually had constitutional consequences.
He gave an interview to a British newspaper.
Yes, he thought he was doing Germany a favor, trying to show how friendly he really was towards Britain, despite appearances.
How did that go wrong?
Spectacularly. The published interview was based on notes from various conversations he'd had. It was supposedly cleared by his Chancellor Bülow's office, though how competently is debatable. In it, Wilhelm claimed things like most Germans were anti-British, but he was a friend, that he'd personally stopped France and Russia forming an anti-British coalition during the Boer War, that the German Navy wasn't aimed at Britain at all, but at Japan.
It sounds incoherent.
It was incoherent, contradictory, and parts of it were just plain untrue. And then there was a line where he observed, "You English are mad, mad, mads as March hares." Oh dear is an understatement. He managed to infuriate the British public, who didn't appreciate being called mad or lectured on how he'd saved them. He infuriated the French and Russians by claiming they'd plotted against Britain. He infuriated the Japanese by saying his fleet was aimed at them. And most importantly, he infuriated the German public and the Reichstag.
Why the Reichstag particularly?
Because it exposed him as a diplomatic liability. His personal interventions were damaging Germany's interests. There was uproar. It caused Wilhelm a genuine nervous breakdown, severe depression. And crucially, the Reichstag forced him to promise that in future, He wouldn't make important political statements without the Chancellor's approval. It was the first real check on his personal rule.
So his influence was actually curtailed after that.
Significantly, yes. He never quite recovered that unquestioned authority or maybe that level of self-confidence again.
And around the same time, there was another scandal brewing, much closer to home. The Eulenburg scandal.
Yes, this ran from about 1906 to 1909. It involved accusations of homosexual conduct illegal at the time against members of Wilhelm's innermost circle, particularly his closest friend, Prince Philipp zu Eulenburg.
And this had political fallout, too.
Huge political fallout. Eulenburg and his circle, the so-called Liebenberg Round Table, were generally seen as voices of moderation, particularly in foreign policy. They were advisors who sometimes counseled caution. The scandal, the trials, the public disgrace, it utterly destroyed Eulenburg politically and personally.
So Wilhelm lost his closest friend and advisor.
Yes, and it caused Wilhelm another nervous breakdown. But politically, the key thing is that the moderate Eulenburg circle was purged from the court.
Replaced by
more hardline military figures, more aggressive nationalists, people less likely to advise caution or diplomacy. Some historians argue this shift in his immediate surroundings, removing that moderating influence, made Germany significantly more likely to take risks to favor military solutions in the years leading up to 1914. The scandal didn't just damage reputations, it potentially altered the course of German policy. Hashtag D, the path to the abyss. July crisis, 1914.
Okay, so we have a Kaiser whose personal authority is damaged, who's surrounded by more hardline figures, a Germany that's diplomatically isolated thanks to a Weltpolitik and the naval race. And then comes Sarajevo, June 28th, 1914.
The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And Wilhelm knew Franz Ferdinand personally, considered him a friend. The news hit him hard.
And his reaction was immediate, wasn't it?
Immediate and decisive, loyalty to a fellow monarch, outrage at the assassination. It translated into that infamous blank check given to Austria-Hungary.
Explain the blank check again.
It was basically an unconditional promise of German support for whatever action Austria-Hungary decided to take against Serbia, the nation they blamed for the assassination. Germany essentially told Vienna, do what you need to do, we've got your back, even if it means war with Russia.
Which was incredibly risky.
Hugely risky. Yeah. It removed any incentive for Austria to be cautious. Knowing they had German backing, they issued that incredibly harsh ultimatum to Serbia, almost designed to be rejected. The blank check was arguably the single decision that turned a Balkan crisis into a potential European war.
And where was Wilhelm while all this was unfolding?
He actually went off on his annual summer cruise to Norway, believing apparently that his firm stance had settled things and deterrence had worked. It shows a staggering lack of awareness of the diplomatic and military wheels he'd set in motion.
When did he realize things were spiraling out of control?
He rushed back to Berlin late, only around July 28th. And then came this moment of almost unbelievable irony or tragedy. He finally read Serbia's reply to the Austrian ultimatum.
Which was surprisingly accommodating, wasn't it? Serbia accepted almost all the demands.
It was remarkably conciliatory. And Wilhelm, reading it, suddenly seemed to grasp that the justification for war was evaporating. He scribbled on the document a brilliant solution, and in barely 48 hours, this is more than could have been expected. A great moral victory for Vienna, but with it, every pretext for war falls to the ground.
So he thought the crisis was over, just like that.
He genuinely seemed to believe in that moment that war could be averted, that Austria had got what it needed diplomatically.
But it was too late. Way too late.
Far too late. While he was writing that note, Austria-Hungary, encouraged by the blank check and weeks of German military assurances, had already declared war on Serbia. Russia, seeing Serbia attacked, had started its mobilization process to defend its ally.
And the German military machine.
The German military machine, based on the Schlieffen Plan, the rigid timetable to knock out France quickly before turning on Russia, was already rolling. Mobilization orders were going out. The generals were telling him it couldn't be stopped.
So the very system he'd championed, the military he'd built up, the aggressive stance he'd taken, it had taken on a life of its own.
Completely. When Wilhelm realized that Britain would likely enter the war if Germany invaded Belgium, as the Schlieffen Plan required, he panicked. He apparently tried to order the Chief of Staff, Moltke the Younger, to halt the advance westward and turn everything against Russia instead.
Could that even be done?
Moltke told him flatly, "Your Majesty, it cannot be done. The deployment of millions of men cannot be improvised." The trains were scheduled. The plans were set. It was too late.
And Wilhelm's reaction?
His famous, bitter retort to Moltke. "Your uncle, the elder Moltke, the strategist of German unification, would have given me a different answer. It was the cry of a man who finally realized he wasn't in control anymore. The supreme warlord had become a passenger in a war machine heading for the abyss.
So the war begins, the war he arguably helped unleash but couldn't control. What was his role during the actual conflict?
Increasingly marginal. He became what historians call the Shadow-Kaiser. He still had the title. The public appearances, reviewing troops, pinning medals, signing papers put in front of them.
But the real power had shifted.
Massively, especially after 1916, when Hindenburg and Ludendorff effectively took control of the war effort at the Supreme Army Command, OHL. Germany became, for all intents and purposes, a military dictatorship. They made the key strategic decisions, often barely consulting Wilhelm. He was a figurehead, largely irrelevant to the running of the war.
How did that sit with the man who craved personal rule?
Terribly, you'd imagine. But by then, the scale of the conflict, the casualties list, the sheer industrial nature of modern warfare, it was beyond his grasp, beyond perhaps anyone's personal control.
And then came the end. Autumn 1918, Germany is clearly losing.
Yes, and the pressure mounts. President Woodrow Wilson made it crystal clear in his communications. The Allies would not negotiate peace with the existing autocratic regime. The monarchy had to go.
And then the final blow, for Wilhelm personally.
The mutiny in the Imperial Navy. His navy. The sailors in Kiel refused orders, protests spread, revolution was in the air across Germany. This apparently shocked him to the core. The loyalty of the military, the very foundation of his worldview, was crumbling.
Did he try to hang on?
He clung desperately to the idea of at least remaining king of Prussia, even if he abdicated as German emperor. He thought he could lead his loyal Prussian troops home.
But the generals knew better.
The generals, including Hindenburg, who had a complex loyalty to the crown but was also a realist, essentially told him it was over. They polled the army commanders at Spa, the headquarters. The answer came back. The army would march home peacefully under its generals, but it would not fight for the Kaiser's throne against the German people.
So he had no support left?
None. Not the military, not the government, certainly not the public. On November 9th, 1918, back in Berlin, Chancellor Prince Max of Baden, seeing the revolution unfolding, took matters into his own hands and announced Wilhelm's abdication of both the imperial and Prussian crowns, actually before Wilhelm had formally agreed.
And Wilhelm?
He was urged by Hindenburg and Ludendorff's successor, Gruner, to flee. The next day, November 10th, utterly broken, he boarded the royal train and crossed the border into the neutral Netherlands. The Hohenzollern dynasty's centuries of rule were over. Hashtag the exile in Huisdorn.
So he ends up in the Netherlands. Did he face immediate demands for extradition? The Allies wanted him tried, didn't they?
Oh, yes. The Treaty of Versailles, Article 227, specifically called for Wilhelm to be tried by an Allied tribunal for a supreme offense against international morality and the sanctity of treaties.
Essentially.
For starting the war.
War crimes charges, basically.
Pretty much. There was huge public pressure in Britain and France, particularly "Hang the Kaiser" was a popular slogan.
But the Dutch refused to hand him over.
They did. Queen Wilhelmina and her government stood firm on the principles of neutrality and the tradition of granting asylum. President Wilson also wasn't keen on the idea of putting a former head of state on trial, fearing it would just create a martyr and destabilize things further. So Wilhelm remained in the Netherlands.
And he settled into exile at Huisdorn, a manor house he purchased. Not exactly a life of hardship, though.
Not remotely. The amount of stuff he was allowed to bring with him from Germany by the Weimar government is just staggering. You mentioned the sources detail this.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. 23 railway carriages full of furniture, another 27 wagons packed with other belongings, art, silver, you name it, 50 freight wagons in total. Plus his cars, boats.
It was the relocation of a royal household, not the flight of a destitute refugee. He lived in considerable comfort at Dorn for the rest of his life.
So what did he do for over 20 years in exile?
He grew a very impressive beard. He wrote his memoirs, trying to justify his actions and shift blame for the war. He sketched, he entertained visitors, mostly old monarchists and former courtiers, and he developed a new passion.
The famous wood chopping. The lumberjack Kaiser.
Exactly. He took to felling trees on the Dorn estate with incredible vigor. What? Thousands upon thousands of trees were apparently chopped down by him over the years.
Any psychological interpretation of that?
It's hard not to see it, isn't it? The man whose withered arm denied him full physical expression in the military sphere. The man subjected to those writing torments. Maybe this relentless physical act of chopping wood was a way to finally assert that physical dominance, that masculine competence he always craved, directing all that restless energy onto something tangible, something he could conquer. #CLC, the Emperor and the Führer.
Now, fast forward to the 1930s. The political landscape in Germany is changing dramatically with the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party. How did Wilhelm view this?
Initially, with a degree of hope. Misplaced hope, obviously. He, and particularly his second wife, Princess Hermine, seemed to think that the Nazis, being nationalists and anti-communist, might actually restore the monarchy. Hermine actively lobbied the Nazi leadership.
What did Hitler think of the old Kaiser?
Utter contempt. Absolute zero intention of bringing back the Hohenzollerns. Hitler blamed Wilhelm for losing the war and saw him as weak and decadent. There are reports of Hitler privately calling Wilhelm what an idiot.
So the hopes for restoration were quickly dashed.
Very quickly. And as Wilhelm observed the Nazis in power, particularly their brutality, his attitude shifted towards revulsion.
Events like the Night of the Long Knives in 1934, the Purge of Rome and the SA.
Yes, and later, the systematic persecution of the Jews, especially after Kristallnacht in 1938. These horrified him.
Didn't he make a famous comment about that?
He did. After Kristallnacht, he's reported to have said, "For the first time, I am ashamed to be a German." He apparently described the Nazi regime as ruled by shirted gangsters and lamented the loss of the rule of law.
So a moral condemnation of the regime.
A strong moral condemnation. But, and here's another Wilhelm paradox, that didn't stop him from feeling a surge of patriotic pride at Germany's early military victories in World War II.
Really? Even though he despised the Nazis?
Yes. When France fell so quickly in 1940, when the Wehrmacht achieved the kind of swift victory his armies had failed to get in 1914, he was apparently elated. He saw it as a vindication of the German military spirit, the spirit nurtured under his empire.
Did he claim some credit?
He reportedly said the victorious generals came from his school. And most astonishingly, he sent congratulatory telegrams to Hitler after the fall of the Netherlands and the fall of Paris, celebrating, as he put it, the final destruction of the Entente Cordiale of Uncle Edward VII.
Wow. So even in exile, condemning Hitler's methods, he's still thrilled to see Britain and France defeated, still fighting those old personal and political battles in his head.
It seems so. The old resentments, the militarism, they ran incredibly deep. He could somehow separate the military achievement, which he admired, from the vile ideology driving it.
And what about his own views in exile? Did they evolve?
They seemed to devolve, sadly. Particularly his antisemitism, which became increasingly virulent and conspiratorial in his later years at Dorn. He got obsessed with blaming a supposed international conspiracy of Anglo-American Freemasonry and the Jews for causing both world wars.
That's disturbing.
Extremely. There are quotes attributed to him advocating for the most extreme measures, using horrifying language about needing to get rid of Jewish influence, even mentioning gas. It's a very dark stain on his final years, showing how far his bitterness and paranoia had taken him. #D-Death and historical judgment.
So Wilhelm finally died in exile at Hohenzollern. When was that?
June 4th, 1941. Just a couple of weeks before Germany launched its invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa.
Was there any question of him being buried back in Germany?
Hitler actually wanted it. Despite his personal contempt for Wilhelm, he saw the propaganda potential. A grand state funeral in Berlin, linking the Third Reich back to the glories of the Second Reich, the old empire.
But Wilhelm himself had other ideas.
He had left specific instructions. One final assertion of his will, perhaps. His body was not to be returned to Germany unless and until the monarchy was restored.
And that wish was respected.
It was, perhaps grudgingly. So he was buried in a small mausoleum built on the grounds of Hohenzollern. There was a funeral service attended by some old imperial German figures, apparently wearing their pre-war uniforms, a rather poignant final echo of a vanished era.
And looking back now, how do historians judge Wilhelm II? Has the view changed over time?
Significantly. Early on, especially from circles close to the former court, there was a tendency to see him as a misunderstood martyr, maybe betrayed by disloyal advisors or overwhelmed by events.
Then later
views, maybe in the mid-20th century, tended to paint him more as just incompetent, a reckless ruler, perhaps well-intentioned, but simply not up to the job, unable to handle the complexities of a modern industrial state and its foreign policy.
But the consensus has shifted again more recently, towards seeing him as more central to the problems.
Yes, I think that's fair to say. Influential historians like John Rohl, who dedicated decades to studying Wilhelm and his court, argue quite forcefully that Wilhelm's personality, his ambition, his insecurity, his impulsiveness, his obsession with the military and the Navy wasn't just incidental. They argue it was actually a key driver of Germany's aggressive policies.
So, poisoning relations with Britain through the naval race, making erratic interventions like the Kruger telegram or the Daily Telegraph affair, surrounding himself with hardliners after the Eulenburg scandal.
Exactly. That his actions and his character actively shaped the environment that made war more likely and perhaps even ensured that when the July crisis hit, the German system was predisposed towards escalation rather than de-escalation. It's a much more critical view, placing significant responsibility on the Kaiser himself.
It's fascinating how perspectives change. Didn't the New York Times call him the chief peacemaker just before the war?
They did. In 1913, a special supplement hailed him as a force for peace in Europe. The contrast with the reality just a year later. It's breathtaking, really. Shows how complex his image was, even then. #tag outro.
So wrapping this up, our deep dive into Wilhelm II really underscores how the personal flaws, the insecurities of one leader can get tragically magnified onto the world stage. That insecure kid with the withered arm needing validation. Somehow, his personal psychology seems mirrored in the reckless, unsteady policies of a whole empire.
It really does. It's a powerful, if disturbing, example of how individual personality can genuinely shape history, steering a major nation towards catastrophe.
But it also brings us back to that structural point you raised earlier about Bismarck's dismissal and the system Wilhelm inherited, or rather the system he created after Bismarck.
Right. Firing Bismarck created that policy vacuum.
Yeah.
And the German Constitution, especially as Wilhelm interpreted it, allowed his personal impulses, Weltpolitik, the naval obsession, the diplomatic blunders, to drive foreign policy without effective checks.
So the provocative thought maybe to leave listeners with is this. How much of the disaster was down to Wilhelm the man, with all his flaws, and how much was due to the weaknesses in the German political system itself? The constitutional flaws that allowed someone like Wilhelm to exert such unchecked personal rule.
It's that classic history question, isn't it? Agency versus structure. Was it the man or the system that enabled the man? Or, more likely, a disastrous combination of both.
And it makes you think, doesn't it, about any system of government, any great power. What are the essential checks, the balances, the sort of institutional friction you need to prevent one potentially unstable personality from taking the whole ship off course, from hijacking national policy and driving towards conflict? It's a question that definitely echoes beyond Wilhelm's time.
It certainly does. Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
We'll catch you next time.